They say power doesn't panic, but when Donald Trump slammed his fist on the desk that morning and said, "Get me Bondi," the panic had already started. It just hadn't screamed out loud yet. Across the country, millions of phones buzzed in unison at exactly 7:13 a.m., flashing the same alert. Federal appeals court issues stay in Trump tariff case. That's not how big moments usually begin. No blood, no sirens, no smoke, just a vibration in your pocket and a nation forgetting how to breathe. But for those who knew where to look, the signs weren't subtle. Trump's hand curled around his phone like it was a weapon. His eyes scanned the headline, then narrowed. See? They still can't touch me. It wasn't a declaration. It was a dare, one that came with consequences. And standing just behind that door waiting to be summoned was Pam Bondi, the legal sword he never kept far. Because when the system pressed pause, Trump's instinct wasn't retreat. It was escalation. 3 states away, in a rust-stained hardware store on the edge of Akron, Ohio, Rachel Torres was refreshing her order sheet for the 5th time in 48 hours. Her voice barely broke above a whisper. "Every time he talks, I lose another order." Her assistant, a college kid with more hope than inventory knowledge, handed her a delivery slip she didn't bother to read. Prices up, delays longer, customers angrier. The president was defending American jobs, they said. Rachel just wanted to keep her lights on. The tariff ruling didn't sound like legal theory to her. It sounded like another lost sale. On Capitol Hill, the mood shifted like someone had opened a trap door. Interns sprinted past cameras. Staffers spilled coffee on briefing papers they wouldn't get time to read. In one hallway, a junior aide shoved open the door to a closed-door caucus meeting. He held his phone like it was on fire. "Sir, it's the tariffs." The appeals court just hit pause. His boss, barely glancing up, muttered, "That's it then. We're on TV by noon." But no one in that room fully grasped it yet. This wasn't about supply chains or trade deficits anymore. It was about something more radioactive, unchecked power, and who was bold enough or reckless enough to use it. Meanwhile, in a Manhattan studio painted in steel and cold light, Adam Klasfeld stared into the red recording light, waiting for his cue. When the producer pointed, he leaned forward like someone lowering a match into gasoline. "This isn't victory," he said slowly. "It's a pause button, the moment before the storm." In the control room, someone whispered, "We go live in 3, 2. But the story was already running wild. Social feeds were jammed with speculation. Some said the court had flinched. Others claimed the system finally blinked. And inside Trump's penthouse office, the gold trim on his desk didn't shine so much as glint like polished brass on a battlefield. Not a throne. He tapped his fingers 3 times. Deliberate. Performed. A signal rehearsed more than once. The door opened like a curtain. A young aide stood ready. "Sir?" Trump didn't look up. "Get me Bondi," he said. "We're not backing down. Not a note of doubt, not even a pause." Because in Trump's world, a legal stay isn't a setback, it's a provocation. And Bondi? She's not a lawyer in this story. She's an accelerant. As the morning fog lifted over Washington, a new headline slashed across the news tickers like a warning shot. Congress to convene emergency hearing on executive overreach. It wasn't just another hearing. It was a signal that even the walls of government had started to shake. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, not a school bell, not a church bell, something deeper. The kind of bell that tolls when a system isn't breaking yet, but knows it's close. America didn't scream, but it sure as hell started listening. The marble beneath their feet had seen decades of political theater, but even the floor seemed to flinch as Donald Trump made his entrance alone, unbothered, and already playing to a crowd that hadn't spoken yet. His red tie hung like a flag in open defiance, swinging with the same theatrical weight as his words. No entourage, no preamble, just the slow, deliberate pace of a man who believed his name had replaced the Constitution in relevance. He lifted his hand not to swear an oath, not to offer respect, but to summon attention. "The world craves American strength," he declared, his voice marinated in hubris. "I bring it." The cameras caught every syllable like gospel, and for a second you'd think he was auditioning for a role he never stopped playing. Emperor of Entitlement. Across the room, Vice President Kamala Harris sat composed, her expression unreadable except for the razor line of disapproval across her lips. In slate, gray, and steel nerves, she radiated restraint, the very thing Trump had spent years branding as weakness. Beside her stood Jasmine Crockett, calm but coiled, a copy of the CIT ruling in her hand like a legal shiv. She didn't need stage direction. She'd come ready to carve. Before anyone could declare quorum, a reporter fired the first shot. "Mr. Trump, the stay has sparked legal confusion. Is this a win or just another headline for your collection?" The room held its breath. Trump didn't even bother turning. He let the smirk answer first. "Every headline is proof I still matter," he said, slow and smug, as if narcissism were now part of the executive branch. The system fears power that doesn't ask permission. There it was, the gospel according to Trump. If the law is inconvenient, it's irrelevant, and if reality doesn't cooperate, redefine it by volume. Crockett stepped forward, unsanctioned but unstoppable. "The law doesn't ask permission," she shot back. "It sets limits." Her tone was low, but it burned. She wasn't there for drama. She was there for the line Trump had already crossed. That's when Trump turned. Slowly, as if annoyed that interruption dared wear heels. He pointed not at her, but at the press pit behind her. "Weakness speaks Latin," he sneered. "I speak reality. Prosperity is not a paragraph, it's a paycheck." The jab hit home with his supporters, who clapped not out of understanding, but out of loyalty, a distinction lost only on those who confuse noise for message. The insult wasn't subtle. It never is with Trump. Why dress ideology and nuance when you can just insult an entire tradition of legal order with a cheap soundbite? Kamala leaned toward Crockett, eyes fixed ahead. "He's here to perform," she said, voice like a scalpel. "But we're here to remind him power still has a leash." And there it was, the line that separated statesman from showman, law from license. One side carried the burden of restraint, the other the addiction to applause. Trump didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and didn't care. He wasn't answering questions. He was rehearsing his next monologue. He wasn't testifying. He was branding. His every step through the chamber said it all. "I don't need to govern, I just need to dominate." The press caught the soundbite. The networks clipped it for prime time. His supporters turned it into memes before the second syllable dropped. And yet, for all the fire in his tone, the foundation under his feet had begun to shift. This wasn't a rally. This wasn't a crowd he could rile and release. This was a chamber lined with people who read laws like weapons and understood silence as strategy. What Trump didn't say spoke louder, that the system he mocked was the same one that once enabled him, that the weakness he derided was actually the very mechanism that kept him from wielding unchecked control, and that when Kamala Harris and Jasmine Crockett stared back, they weren't doing it for Twitter. They were doing it for the Republic, still trying to hold its shape. Outside, the air crackled with anticipation. Inside, something far more dangerous brewed. The sense that this time, the leash might just snap. The pause after Kamala's final sentence hung in the air like gunpowder. No one exhaled. Because when the vice president said, "History won't remember who shouted. It will remember who stood between power and chaos," the room understood this wasn't just oratory. It was a line carved in constitutional stone. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her words did the lifting, her posture the warning. But Donald Trump, never one to recognize gravitas unless it was gilded and engraved with his own name, leaned back in his chair like a man lounging at the country club while the fire department knocked on the door. Congress dithers. "Towns die," he said, waving away her concerns as if she were a particularly dull episode of C-SPAN. "I act. That's not tyranny. That's leadership. Only Donald Trump could confuse urgency with absolutism and call it patriotism. Only Donald Trump could bypass legal scrutiny and sell it back as populism, discounted, of course, for those who chant loud enough. Jasmine Crockett, never one to let nonsense fly first class, didn't flinch. She tossed the Court of International Trade report onto the hearing table like a challenge coin. The thud was subtle, but it cut through the silence like a closing gavel. "The court didn't agree," she said, locking eyes with him. "Even your own judge said your tariffs overstepped." It was true, and worse for him, it was documented. A ruling penned in clear language by a judge Trump himself had praised just 6 months earlier as a straight shooter. Now, that same judge was part of the conspiracy, no doubt. Trump tilted his head with the mockery of a man whose worldview began and ended with applause. "Precedent is comfort food for the weak," he drawled. "I cook reality." It was the kind of line that played well on cable news and in YouTube compilations, the kind that fed rallies but starved credibility. You could practically see a Fox chyron being typed in real time. Trump, "I cook reality." If irony were edible, America could have fed the homeless for a decade. Kamala didn't blink. She stepped closer, not to provoke, but to remind. "It grants power, not license," she repeated, nodding toward the 1977 emergency statute still open on the desk before her. "There is a line." She didn't have to say who crossed it. The air already knew. Trump's next volley came with the confidence of someone who thinks fire counts as warmth. "You quote doctrine," he scoffed. "I save factories." The implication was clear. Policies backed by law are for academics and cowards. Real men throw tariffs like grenades and call the ashes a jobs program. Crockett didn't raise her voice. Her rebuttal was surgical. "You're not saving anything," she said, voice flat as a death certificate. You're setting fire and calling it heat. And just like that, the illusion cracked. The hero pose, the self-made mythology torn down by 9 words and a woman who had done her reading. Then, the room changed. The back door opened not loudly, not dramatically, but with the stillness that made the silence louder. All eyes shifted. In walked Pam Bondi, a stack of folders under one arm, expression locked in that unbothered, courtroom-chiseled neutrality that always seems seconds away from a smirk. She wasn't here to testify. She was here to translate arrogance into legalese. Trump grinned, eyes following her like a man watching his favorite lawyer enter a casino with a blank check. "Now," he said, "they'll hear from the law." As if Bondi were the law. As if the Constitution had been waiting backstage in stilettos. It wasn't a statement of defense. It was an opening act for the next insult. Because in Trump's show, law isn't something you follow. It's something you bend, brand, and beam to your base. And if the court says no, just add it to the script and call it deep state theater. The microphones flickered. Pens moved. The camera light turned red again. And the room, once frozen in the gravity of principle, braced for the arrival of performance disguised as jurisprudence. If the Constitution had veins, they were tightening. Because what was coming next wouldn't just test the law, it would test whether anyone still respected it. Pam Bondi didn't enter the hearing room, she descended into it, like a statue that had learned to walk. Her heels echoed just enough to imply purpose, and the folder she placed on the polished table had all the theatrical weight of a dropped guillotine. No greeting, no throat clearing, just a cold stare across the table and a sentence carved in stone. "Madam Vice President, the statute is clear. 1977. Passed in crisis, invoked in crisis." It was the legal equivalent of a mic drop delivered with all the warmth of a Frost advisory. Pam wasn't here to argue. She was here to declare. In her world, law wasn't a process, it was a weapon you swing once and never apologize for. Kamala didn't flinch. She didn't even offer the courtesy of eye contact. Her response came sideways, laced with steel. "Crisis doesn't erase the Constitution. It calls us to protect it." It wasn't rebuttal, it was doctrine. She didn't speak like a woman defending opinion. She spoke like someone defending oxygen. Bondi, unbothered, opened her folder with the precision of a funeral director. "The president is authorized to act when national economic security is at stake," she recited. "Tariffs are action. Law enables it." The irony, of course, was that she delivered it with the detachment of someone explaining a coffee policy, not a constitutional overreach. It wasn't advocacy. It was indifference in pearls. Jasmine Crockett snapped the silence like it owed her money. "Action that crushes small businesses," she cut in, eyes locked. "You cite law like it's armor, but you're bleeding the people behind it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It punched precisely where it aimed at the illusion that paperwork makes power pure. Trump, never one to resist the scent of a soundbite, tossed in his own garnish of disdain. "They'd rather argue commas while factories shut their gates," he barked, as if punctuation were the true villain of the American economy. It was classic Trump. Turn complexity into a straw man, then set it on fire and declare yourself the firefighter. The man's war on syntax would be funnier if it weren't constantly aimed at the rule of law. Kamala tapped her pen, not as a warning, but as a funeral bell for subtlety. "And you'd rather burn procedure than face restraint," There was no camera angle that didn't catch her eyes narrowing. She wasn't reacting. She was calculating the exact degree to which her opponents were banking on the public's ignorance. Pam looked up, her voice steady, almost bored. Emergency doesn't wait for consensus. The line landed like a slogan, clean, concise, and deeply terrifying. Because what she framed as urgency sounded suspiciously like justification for unaccountability. That's the trick with Bondi. She never raises her voice. She just lowers the standard. Crockett's laugh was short, sharp, and unamused, and dictatorship never asks for it. No hyperbole, just a scalpel. The gallery didn't gasp. They didn't need to. The tension in the room inhaled for them. The microphones picked up the breathlessness. The cameras captured every stiffened spine on the dais. Some leaned back, others folded arms like shields. The ones still scribbling were no longer taking notes. They were drafting political escape routes. Kamala finally turned to face Bondi fully. Her tone was courtroom cold. Your reading of the statute grants convenience. Mine defends continuity. It was the cleanest dissection of Bondi's strategy yet. One side treated law like scaffolding, the other like a folding chair. Pam's lips barely moved. The law doesn't bend to interpretation, she said. It bends to purpose. If there were ever a sentence that deserved to be cross-examined under oath, that was it. Because what purpose exactly was being served? Stability or personal mythology? And then came the nod. Trump, who had been swiveling slightly in his chair like a man bored during jury duty, suddenly straightened. He nodded at Bondi, not as thanks, but as benediction. The message was clear. Case closed. The king had spoken. His legal cleric had confirmed it, and anyone still objecting was just afraid of results. But the thing about wrapping unlawful ambition in the language of law is that it doesn't change the shape, it just softens the blow, until someone sharpens the response. And as Bondi gathered her papers and Kamala reached for the next folder, it was clear. The sharp part was still coming. The silence that followed Pam Bondi's final line wasn't relief. It was recoil. Like the room had inhaled too deeply on something flammable and was now waiting to see which spark would ignite it. But the spark didn't come from the witness table. It came from the benches, muffled behind a pale blue surgical mask and 65 years of congressional fatigue. A Democratic senator leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "If we let this stand, there's no limit left." His tone wasn't alarmist. It was resigned, like someone watching the dam break and wondering who still remembers how to swim. The reply came sharp from across the aisle. A Republican, younger, louder, and perfectly media-trained, shot back with clenched jaw sincerity. Then maybe it's time the law caught up with the crisis. There it was, the great GOP sleight of hand. When principle becomes inconvenient, repackage it as outdated. Nothing says courage quite like retrofitting the Constitution with a crisis clause, preferably one you define yourself. Meanwhile, in the CNN control room, the Chiron writers were having a field day. Power or overreach? America waits. Always the question, never the answer. The producers knew the formula. Ambiguity sells airtime. The audience doesn't tune in for clarity. They tune in for conflict. Back in the chamber, Kamala Harris stood up with deliberate precision. No flurry, no page shuffle. Just one hand on the desk and the other still gripping her pocket-sized Constitution like it was a scalpel, and she was done watching amateurs make incisions with a chainsaw. "Law is not a museum piece," she said. "It lives only if it resists pressure." It wasn't just a quote. It was a rebuke dressed in legal formal wear. She wasn't preserving tradition. She was defending the firewall. Trump, of course, couldn't resist. "It lives only when it serves people, not professors," he sneered, casually turning civic illiteracy into applause lines. There was no applause, but in his mind, the crowd never stops clapping. In Trump world, syllables are just opportunities to market strength and sell contempt. He doesn't argue. He merchandises resentment. Crockett, pointing to the report in front of her, fired the next shot without blinking. This panel, bipartisan, concluded overreach. Not political procedural. That was the part his defenders never addressed. Not activist judges. Not academic theory. Just basic legal review from people who'd actually read the statute and had the courage to follow it. Trump took a step forward, as if proximity could outmatch logic. "Bipartisanship is the shield cowards hide behind," he growled. "I don't wait for panels. I lead." It was vintage performance, wrapped in bravado, and delivered with the solemnity of a man who thinks his business card outranks the Bill of Rights. For someone who demands loyalty to institutions, he has an uncanny talent for lighting them on fire. Pam Bondi said nothing, her face locked in neutral like a seasoned attorney watching her client throw punches in court. She knew better than to interrupt. She also knew this wasn't about winning the legal argument, it was about dominating the moment. And moments, in Trump's calculus, are always about volume, not veracity. Outside the chamber, the internet was on fire. Tariff tyranny was climbing by the minute, a symphony of users slamming Trump's economic logic as an atomic hammer used to kill a gnat. Right beside it, Kamala versus chaos surged like a tide, some celebrating her restraint, others dismissing it as weakness. The American algorithm had picked its battlefield, and nuance wasn't invited. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Rachel Torres stared at her supplier's text like it was a death notice. Delay again. She exhaled through her teeth and muttered, "They're playing chess. I'm playing Russian roulette." In that moment, the Constitution wasn't theoretical. It was survival. And from where she stood, every delay wasn't about policy. It was about whether her doors stayed open through next week. Back in the hearing room, the air shifted again. Crockett locked eyes with Trump and said what no one else dared. "Leadership that fears limits isn't leadership," she said. "It's impulse with a microphone." It wasn't an accusation. It was a mirror. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told the truth in a room that had long stopped recognizing it. Trump didn't flinch. "And you're what discipline with a teleprompter?" he snapped, voice dripping with the contempt of a man who mistakes preparation for weakness and vocabulary for betrayal. The man who built an empire on bankruptcies now lecturing others about consistency. Then the lights changed, subtle but unmistakable. A technician adjusted the feed. A red recording bulb clicked on. The cross-examination phase was next. The tension didn't rise, it solidified. This wasn't just theater anymore. This was steel grinding against steel. And everyone in the room knew. The sharpest questions hadn't even been asked yet. The camera didn't move. It retreated by instinct, not instruction. Even the lens seemed to recognize that what was happening wasn't meant to be viewed, but felt. Trump had closed the distance, one palm pressed flat against the oak table, his gaze locked on Kamala like a man daring history to blink. "You speak of boundaries," he said, voice low, almost gentle in the way venom sometimes is. "But you've never had to watch a city die while the courts debate paragraphs." It wasn't a question. It was a performance of pain, curated, sharpened, and sold in real time. The implication was obvious. Empathy belonged to those who bulldozed procedure, not to those who defended it. Kamala didn't so much as shift. Her response was still as stone and twice as cutting. "I've watched law die in silence," she said. "It doesn't scream when it breaks, it whispers." A line not meant for applause but for indictment. She wasn't answering him. She was exposing him. Because the real tragedy wasn't bureaucratic delay, it was the erosion of accountability masquerading as urgency. Pam Bondi, sensing a break in the tension she could exploit, slipped in her contribution with that familiar fusion of Southern charm and constitutional amnesia. "The people didn't elect us to stall," she said. "They elected strength, and strength sometimes means discomfort. Ah, yes, the gospel of discomfort for everyone but those in power. Funny how the architects of chaos always frame resistance as delay and their own recklessness as decisive courage." Crockett didn't flinch. She stepped forward like a woman who's heard that kind of nonsense before in courtrooms, on talk shows, in every room where power mistakes volume for truth. "Strength without control is how nations collapse," she said. "That's not discomfort. That's demolition." Her voice didn't rise, it sharpened. "Because when a building starts to crumble, it's not the noise that matters. It's who designed the foundation." Trump turned to the committee, now with the cadence of a man preaching to the back row of a stadium that wasn't there. "You hesitate," he growled. "China doesn't. Mexico doesn't. I don't. It was patriotism by comparison, a geopolitical mad lib that replaced nuance with nationalism and diplomacy with one-man rule. As if international complexity could be solved with chest-puffing and flag-draped tweets." Kamala walked slowly to the center, like a prosecutor delivering her final cross. "You conflate urgency with authority," she said. "One justifies speed. The other defines scope. No finger-pointing, no shouting, just a scalpel slicing through the fog of self-glorifying deflection." Her words didn't attack. They corrected. And that, to Trump, was always the greater sin. He squinted, measuring the moment like a man scanning a teleprompter only he could see. "I define outcomes," he shot back. "That's what voters remember. In other words, history is a highlight reel, and I own the editing rights." Crockett lifted the CIT ruling, her voice flat and lethal. "Then explain why your own judge appointed by you wrote this. The president's tariff actions exceeded statutory bounds. The line cut not because it was clever, but because it was in ink, in law, in black and white." Trump didn't answer. He didn't even pretend to. He turned his head slightly, as if the words had been in a language not worth acknowledging. But his silence wasn't strength. It was retreat dressed as disdain. Pam leaned over and tapped the folder in front of her with one manicured finger, the gesture as controlled as it was dismissive. "Appointees don't make kings," she said. "But neither do opinions dethrone resolve. A sentence designed for viral clips and bumper stickers, morally empty, legally hollow, but rhetorically perfect for those who believe democracy is just a speed bump on the road to dominance." Kamala exhaled once, slow and audible. Then she delivered the line that would echo long after the hearing was over. "Resolve without law is rule by mood," she said. "This nation outlived kings for a reason. No thunder, no pause for applause. Just history staring back at ambition and quietly saying, 'Not this time.'" A hush swept through the room like a cold draft under a locked door. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, it tightens. The kind that presses against your spine and whispers, "You're witnessing something being drawn, a boundary, a reckoning, a line that someone just dared to cross." And as the room sat suspended in that stillness, even the camera operator took a step back. Not because the shot demanded it, but because the moment did. Ohio didn't have a seat in the hearing room, but it had a front-row view to the fallout. In a small hardware store just outside Akron, Rachel Torres stood behind her counter like a soldier in the wrong war, outnumbered, outfunded, and running low on patience. On the television bolted to the wall, the screen split neatly in two. Kamala Harris on one side, Donald Trump on the other. The chyron read, "Emergency powers in question." Rachel didn't need the translation. She already knew what it meant. Another shipment delayed. Another invoice unpaid. Another customer walking out without what they came for. "They argue over power," she muttered, eyes fixed on the screen. "I argue over payroll." A college kid stocking shelves nearby looked up, naive and still optimistic. "So, is this good or bad for us?" he asked, like a Supreme Court ruling might come with a coupon code. Rachel didn't even blink. "Doesn't matter," she said. "I still gotta pay rent on Tuesday." That was the reality Congress never televised. That while Trump and Kamala battled over constitutional clauses, people like Rachel were calculating how many days late a power bill could be before the lights went out. Back in D.C., the marble columns stood still, but the temperature inside the hearing room had dropped a few degrees. A congressman leaned forward, voice steady, question sharp. "Mr. President, do you believe the executive can override both Congress and the courts under the label of emergency?" It was a trap, and everyone knew it, but Trump answered without hesitation, the way only someone convinced of their own righteousness or invincibility ever does. "When the country's survival is on the line," he said, "someone has to act. That someone is me." Kamala's response came not as retaliation, but as calibration. "That someone," she said calmly, "still answers to the Constitution." It was the kind of line that didn't need volume, it needed memory. Memory of oaths sworn, of branches separated, of checks designed to withstand the storms of ego. Jasmine Crockett stepped in, her tone tightening like a snare. "The same Constitution you promised to uphold," she reminded him. Not to sidestep. She wasn't grandstanding. She was testifying. And the charge wasn't just overreach. It was betrayal dressed as urgency. Trump clenched his fist, not dramatically, but with the subtle aggression of a man who sees constraint as treason. "I uphold it," he snapped, "by defending jobs, not theories." The irony, of course, was that his defense came with more layoffs than any lecture hall ever caused. But in the Trump doctrine, jobs are never lost due to policy, only sabotaged by those who dare to question it. A retired federal judge, sitting in the back of the chamber like a ghost of civics past, shook his head slowly. He didn't speak for the record, but the press caught it anyway. "Defending jobs isn't a license to redraw boundaries," he whispered, just loud enough to be heard by those still listening. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, Rachel Torres didn't bother muting the TV. She just looked at the screen and said to no one, "Keep your speeches, I need delivery trucks." It wasn't cynical. It was practical. She didn't care who won the hearing. She cared whether Friday's shipment arrived on Thursday. Online, the digital crowd had already chosen sides. The hashtag #HatNoCrown. Here surged through Twitter, an anthem of resistance for those who saw the day's argument not as partisan wrangling, but as a last stand against imperial drift. Meanwhile, a clip of Jasmine Crockett's earlier rebuke, "Impulse is not leadership," had crossed 500,000 views in under an hour. It wasn't just trending, it was landing. The story was no longer about tariffs or statutes. It was about who got to decide when the rules no longer applied and who paid the price when they didn't. And for people like Rachel, the answer wasn't in the chamber. It was in the silence that followed when the TV cut to commercial and the backroom went dark. The gavel struck wood not as a judgment, but as a reminder that not all endings come with answers. "This committee issues no verdict," the chair announced, "but the stay remains. Litigation continues." It wasn't closure. It was a comma in a sentence no one dared finish. The room, still heavy with the weight of what hadn't been said, did not exhale. It paused, uncertain whether anything had actually changed or just been postponed. Kamala Harris adjusted her microphone slowly, deliberately. Her eyes scanned the room, not to provoke, but to imprint. "This is not a victory," she said, tone clipped and calm. "It's a reminder. No triumph, no gloating, no call for celebration, just a line etched in institutional stone. You don't have to win to matter. You just have to endure long enough to remind them why the law still breathes." Trump didn't move at first. He stood still, as if the floor had betrayed him. The smugness he carried into the hearing had not shattered, it had evaporated. What remained was stillness, the kind that doesn't admit defeat, but recognizes the resistance is real. His hands dropped to his sides, not in surrender, but without purpose. Somewhere between arrogance and exhaustion, he had become quiet. Pam Bondi closed her folder with the care of someone sealing a vault, her expression unreadable. She didn't leave. She didn't need to. This wasn't her courtroom. It was her echo chamber, and the echo had faded. Crockett stepped down from the dais, her heels clicking once, then silence. She didn't look at Trump. She didn't look at the press. She looked straight ahead, like someone walking out of a fire with the matchbox still in her pocket. Online, the hearing metastasized. Kamala's quote, "Power that respects no borders, answers to none," blew up across platforms like a civic flare. MSNBC looped it with subtitles. Fox News used it as a contrast line under Trump's B-roll. TikTok stitched it into edits with booming soundtracks and shots of crumbling marble. In the war of words, one sentence had survived the filter, and it wasn't his. Back in Ohio, Rachel Torres's phone vibrated. A new message from her supplier. Shipment released. Temporary clearance granted. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. Then, for the first time all week, her eyes left the numbers and stared out the dusty window. A breath. A smile, quick, cautious, but unmistakably human. "Maybe," she said under her breath, "maybe the law did hold this time." In Manhattan, Adam Klasfeld sat beneath studio lights. His tie loosened, his voice lowered. "The court didn't rule," he said into the microphone. But the nation heard something louder than a verdict. resistance. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The sentence had its own gravity. Outside the hearing chamber, Trump emerged into the sea of cameras like a man trying to outrun gravity with posture. He ignored every question. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, but his mouth moved only once. "I lead," he said into the flashbulbs. "Let them debate." It was bravado without the bass, a line rehearsed for a headline, but delivered without the weight it once carried. Kamala exited through the other side, her pace measured, her presence intact. A reporter caught up, breathless. "Madam Vice President, do you believe the people heard the law today?" Kamala didn't stop walking. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I believe they felt it." And in that answer, something rare happened in Washington. Accountability didn't scream. It whispered, and people actually listened. As the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome and the nation retreated into its nightly rituals of noise and scrolling, the political aftershocks had already begun to ripple across the map. On Fox News, a bold banner declared, "Trump cornered but unshaken, the verbal equivalent of a bruised ego wrapped in a flag." Over at CNN, the tone was more existential. "Democracy pushes back?" A question mark strategically placed, as if democracy had forgotten it had muscles until today. And on Newsmax, where subtlety goes to die, the chyron lit up like a Vegas billboard. Pam Bondi dismantles Kamala's fictional limits? The punctuation did more heavy lifting than the anchor. In Ohio, Rachel Torres tapped her calculator like it owed her money. The numbers lined up. The freight was in motion. She dialed quickly. "Go ahead," she said, eyes on the invoice. "Send him in." She wasn't waiting for a verdict. She was waiting for goods. But in a country where court decisions move slower than inflation, a delivery truck might be the closest thing to justice. Meanwhile, Adam Klasfeld leaned into his studio mic in New York, his voice hushed but clear, the tone of a man who knows drama when it walks through the Capitol. "Maybe America remembered today," he said, pausing just long enough for breath and effect, "that law isn't loud. It's firm." The soundboard engineer didn't even need to cue music. The silence after the sentence said everything. TikTok, in its usual mix of teenage chaos and unexpected clarity, delivered a viral split screen. Trump's "I lead" intercut with Kamala's "not above the law," both echoing under a low bass line that sounded like constitutional thunder. It wasn't activism, it was attention. 1 million views and counting. No think piece could move like that. Back inside a congressional subroom, no larger than a decent kitchen, Jasmine Crockett sat alone, removing her mic with the care of someone packing up armor after battle. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The stack of documents in front of her wasn't paper. It was evidence of tension, of restraint, of resistance. And tonight, that was enough. Kamala Harris, now seated in a government vehicle gliding silently through D.C. streets, didn't check her phone or brief a staffer. She opened a printed copy of the 1977 statute, the one they'd argued over for hours, and underlined, with surgical precision, a single line in red: "Only within statutory bounds." The ink didn't shout. It etched. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She remembered. And then there was Pam Bondi, drenched in studio lights, post-hearing makeup barely smudged. Her tone was lawyer smooth in a post-appearance interview. "This wasn't a trial," she said coolly. "It was a statement." And ours landed. The phrasing was surgical, a boast disguised as closure. But it was more revealing than she realized, because for once, the audience wasn't looking for blood. They were looking for who still knew how to read the damn script. And as the clips looped and headlines split screens across the nation, one question sharpened beneath all the noise. In a government that shouts, who still has the power to whisper something permanent? Night had draped itself over the Capitol like a final curtain, casting the marble dome in a soft amber haze, beautiful but indifferent. No applause followed. No sirens rang. Just the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but confronts. The kind that sits beside you, waiting for a response you can't give. Inside a black SUV with tinted windows and bulletproof certainty, Donald Trump scrolled through the usual flood hashtags torn between idol worship and constitutional rage. The glow from the screen lit up the creases around his eyes like battle scars. They remember the bold, he muttered, half to himself, half to history. And maybe he believed it. Or maybe he just needed to. Upstairs, Kamala Harris stood in her office beneath a single desk lamp. Her hand rested on a dog-eared copy of the Constitution, its pages marked like an old family Bible. Behind her, Jasmine Crockett leaned silently against the wall, arms crossed. Kamala didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This nation refuses crowns," she said. "It always has. It was not a declaration. It was a diagnosis. The kind you give a country that flirts too often with forgetting itself." Across the Midwest, Rachel Torres flicked off the fluorescent light above her register. Another shift. Another ledger closed. She typed a quick message to her supplier. "Let's bet on next week. Confirm the rest. No lawyers, no speeches, just hope, rendered in logistics." On the sidewalk outside her shop, a father and daughter chatted as they bought rope and batteries, not preparing for a collapse, just fixing something in the backyard. Life didn't pause for hearings. It hedged its bets. In a downtown Manhattan studio, Adam Klasfeld leaned into his final sign-off. His voice was slow, not somber, just deliberate. Tonight wasn't about who won, he said. It was about who remembered why the lines matter. He left the mic on a soft hum, like a nation still processing its own echo. Pam Bondi, fresh from her post-show debrief, didn't answer the questions hurled at her outside the studio. Not because she lacked an answer, but because, in her world, silence was sometimes more performative than spin. She walked briskly, chin high as if gravity bowed to conviction, and yet no amount of framing or posturing could outshine the moment's quiet truths. This wasn't about tariffs anymore, or statutes, or executive theories dressed up as salvation. It was about memory, about the institutional muscle memory of a republic that has, time and again, stared at power dressed in grandeur and chosen the rule of law instead. The camera didn't pan, the music didn't swell. The last frame settled on a flickering neon sign outside Rachel's shop. A loose wire made it pulse like a heartbeat. And somewhere in that flicker, in that mundane continuity of families shopping and workers closing shop, the answer revealed itself not in power's roar, but in restraint's whisper. Even when the throne calls, the law answers first.